Albert Robida was born in 1848 in Compiègne, about 50 miles north of Paris, the son of a carpenter. As a child, he spent much of his time drawing, but when old enough, he enrolled into university to study law. Predictably, it wasn't a good fit, and he realised that in order to be happy, he was going to have to at least attempt to pursue a career as an illustrator. So, armed with a portfolio of the many drawings he'd created in his own time, and without benefit of any formal art education, he tried to find work in Paris. In 1866, and still only 18 years old, he was offered a job as a staff illustrator with Le Journal Amusant, and for the best part of a decade he worked for the magazine, creating a large volume of humorous pen and ink drawings which became progressively more accomplished and expressive. It's recorded that he was also working simultaneously for other Parisian magazines, and in 1871 not only did he enlist in the National Guard to defend Paris from the revolutionary Communard uprising, but also found time to document the conflict for newspapers. The attempted coup was suppressed, and having published a portfolio of drawings he'd created during the uprising, he reverted to both civilian status and more humorous subject matter for Le Journal Amusant and others. In 1876, Robida married Marguerite, or according to some sources, Cécile Noiret, and once settled into their home in the Parisian suburbs, the couple set about producing 7 children in the years that followed. It was around this time that he left Le Journal and embarked on a tour of France's neighbouring countries. It isn't recorded how long he spent doing this, but the first published evidence of his travels appeared in 1878 with the Old Towns of Italy. The book featured a collection of pen drawings, focusing primarily on the many buildings of antiquity he encountered. He followed this only a year later with another using the identical format, The Old Towns of Switzerland, which also sold well. But far more significantly, it was also in 1879 that his own fantasy story, The Very Extraordinary Travels of Saturnin Farandoul, was published. This was a good-natured satirical parody of Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days, and it was an enormous undertaking requiring several hundred individual images, and it was published serially between 1879 and 1880. The images and Robida's written narrative both exhibited a remarkably playful imagination. Robida obviously delighted in the humorously absurd possibilities of the stories he'd created. And so did his readers, making it a significant popular and financial success. There is evidence of some of these images having been coloured, but for now I'll just mention that the colouring may have taken place in later editions. In 1880, Robida published the first in a series of contemporary satires, gathered under the collective title La Grande Mascarade Parisienne. As far as I can tell, there were 5 in total, all of which he wrote and all of which were peppered with line-only spot illustrations and a considerable number of full pages in colour for good measure. This early use of colour in Robida's work raises some questions, none of which I've found a satisfactory answer for. Full-colour lithography had yet to be invented, and although the more complex, less faithful chromolithographic process was in use at the time, a comparison with images reproduced that way showed clearly that these were not. My best guess has to be that the black and white engraved line work was subsequently and relatively crudely coloured using woodblock printing. And quite a few others, such as his British contemporary Walter Crane, were known to be using this process. Whether it was Robida himself or a print technician who carried this out is also unknown, but I suspect he was far too busy to be overly involved in this aspect of the process. All of which is amateur detective work on my part and should not be taken as gospel. 1880 was also the year he published La Tour Enchantée, a highly amusing and fanciful tale involving magic spells, eccentric characters and general madness created as complex and highly absorbing monochromes. All of which makes it all the more remarkable that in the same year, in partnership with the publisher Georges Decaux, Robida established his own magazine, La Caricature, which should not be confused with the earlier incarnation of the same name, which had memorably featured the work of J.J. Granville and Honoré Daumier up to its demise in 1843. Naturally enough, La Caricature served as a platform for him to demonstrate both his satirical wit and graphic prowess, and the covers were printed with colour overlays on top of engravings in precisely the same way as his colour images for La Grande Mascarade. The pages, on the other hand, remained primarily but not exclusively monochrome throughout the magazine's existence. And although he necessarily hired the illustrative services of others, his own work was conspicuously dominant in the magazine. Unlike its extinct namesake, La Caricature was a determinedly frivolous publication, and consequently politics rarely featured in its pages. Instead, the content could generally be categorised as societal observation and ridicule, and both the tone of the writing and the humorous imagery remained generally good-natured and upbeat. In the same year, the third of his travel books, The Old Towns of Spain, was published, which was another welcome addition to his growing and enduringly popular collection. But despite his extracurricular activities, his commitment to the illustration, management and publication of La Caricature never faltered. 1882 saw a return to travel writing and illustration, with a collection gathered under the banner La Vieille France, with separate editions about the various regions of his homeland. It was also in that year that he and his family moved to Argentière, a charming location on the River Seine, a few miles northwest of the city. Incredibly, while doing all this, he had also been working on what would come to be recognised as one of his greatest and most enduring pieces of work. In 1883, his science fiction novel The 20th Century was first published, a far from entirely serious prediction of what life in the early 1950s might be like, featuring all manner of technological advances. Some remain manifestly preposterous, while others have proved to be remarkably accurate, but all images retained a Victorian essence which is now seen as the origins of what has since come to be called steampunk. Although many of these generally complex crowded scenes were reproduced as line only, there were others printed lithographically in tonal monochrome halftone, and even a few which were overprinted with colour, which greatly added to the book's general desirability and visual variety. And Robida used the dramatic events of the storyline to speculate about the impact of technological advances, while using it, like much of the best speculative fiction, to hold up a satirical mirror to reflect what for Robida were contemporary societal issues, generally with the broad intention to amuse and fascinate, but also on occasion to warn about some of the less desirable consequences of technological advancement. It's hard to imagine how, given the hundreds of drawings he produced for this book, and the not inconsiderable matter of writing it in the first place, but the same year saw the publication of Le Voyage de Monsieur Dumoulin, which, although primarily black and white, also featured the occasional use of colour. But in this instance, these illustrations appear to have been painted with actual watercolour washes, with more overtly tonal effects than seen previously. And as full-colour litho was still not a possibility, my best guess is that they were either coloured using chromolithography or possibly coloured at a later date when full-colour offset was widely available. The evidence of his continued presence in La Caricature at this time clearly indicates that he was every bit as involved as he had been even before the publication of these books. And like that other great artist and illustrator of his age, Gustave Doré, Robida had effectively become a one-man industry and was keeping quite a few engravers and printers in work. And although when he illustrated the works of the 16th century author François Rabelais, he did at least give himself a bit of time off from actual writing, his visualizations of the author's riotously satirical scenarios proved to be a perfect fit for the tone and medieval setting of the various tales when published in 1885. Apart from his usual ongoing work at La Caricature, nothing was actually published in 1886, but that was only because he was evidently occupied with the writing and illustration of the second of his great speculative books, War and the 20th Century, which was published in 1887. This book concerned itself exclusively with technological developments which could greatly enhance and diversify the means of slaughter used during conflicts between the nations in Europe and further afield. It was obviously a reflection on the increased mechanism and engineering triumphs of the late Victorian period, which he projected into a possible future. And although despite the seriousness of the subject matter much of the work was actually darkly humorous, it proved to be highly predictive of the Great War of just 17 years later, with its use of submarines, tanks, poison gas and flamethrowers. And although the aeroplane itself didn't make an appearance, there were a significant number of images depicting the murderous potential of aerial warfare. Implausible as it seems, he appears to have been just as busy with his cover illustrations for La Caricature and continued to make good-natured fun of contemporary French society as before. In 1888, and even more implausibly, he actually published another 3 books. Both 100 New Stories and Le Cas du Vidame were created with sharply defined pen and ink monochromes. But the third in that year, the 19th Century, was a more lavish publication similar to his 20th Century Speculations, but which confined itself to highlighting some of the absurdities and conceits of the middle classes in his own time, featuring an array of line drawing and full-colour images, all satirical in nature. 1889's Exposition comique was another fanciful affair, this time poking fun at that year's wildly popular Paris Exposition, and the technological wonders on display, not least of which was the Eiffel Tower. And he created more humour based on the event and the popular fascination with the tower in his work for La Caricature. But although still active with illustration work for the magazine, the volume was by this point somewhat reduced. And other than the illustrations he continued to produce for the covers, he was by now leaving the bulk of the interior page illustrations to his other contributors. In 1890, Robida created this poster design, and there were others created around this time which indicated that whatever his prowess as an illustrator, the design of posters wasn't high on his list of talents. Of course, it's quite possible that in fact he had nothing to do with the posters other than his illustrations were used as the visual focus within what might charitably be called the design. In the same year, another 2 travel books were published, one of which was about Brittany and the other on the subject of Normandy. Both featured more well-observed lithographic drawings in this by now extensive and acclaimed series. The last of Robida's predictive technologically themed books, Electric Life, was first published serially in Science Illustrated magazine in 1890 and subsequently in book form in 1892. The story was again set in the 1950s and looked more at the potential impact of widespread use and application of electrical power and gadgets on everyday life in the future. Unlike the 2 previous 20th century themed books which had been engraved, the images this time around appear to have been created as drawn lithographs. They may have been drawn by Robida directly onto the lithographic stones, but it's also possible that they were transferred photolithographically from his graphite or charcoal originals, as by this time the technology was in place to enable him to do so. I'm assuming that in the case of the colour images, the actual colour was applied on subsequent print runs. The 1891 book, Our Grandmothers, wasn't satirical at all, more a collection of line and wash colour illustrations of the evolution of women's fashions over the centuries. And although pleasant enough, it seemed an odd and even somewhat mundane digression from his usual approach. In 1892, Robida parted ways with La Caricature after an intense, profitable and creatively productive relationship lasting 12 years. And in the following year he published a collection of scenic views of historic France as colour lithographs which simply set out to portray some of the splendid historical architecture and scenic views from France's past. Naturally enough, given his talent for such image making, it fulfilled its mission with visual success. In 1895 he returned to this theme with another book, Paris from Century to Century, which was a nostalgic evocation of the older medieval Paris, which had been destroyed to make way for Emperor Napoleon III's vision of a grander, more contemporary city, which had been carried out from the 1850s to the 1870s under the direction of George Haussmann. It was also in 1895 that Robida published another novel, a charming children's fantasy titled At the Top of the Belfry, with a collection of amusing absurdist illustrations which didn't suffer in the slightest from being only printed in monochrome. And continues to defy anyone to even attempt to keep up with his prodigious creative output. In the same year, he was one of a trio of illustrators who supplied illustrations for a handful of the fairy tales of Charles Perrault, which dominated the visual content of this publication. In 1898, his illustrations for several of Shakespeare's better-known dramatic works were published. The images in this instance were line-only monochromes, but there were 8 plays contained in this book, and each boasted numerous illustrated moments from the narratives. The illustrations were obviously created as pen and ink drawings, and I suspect that they were reproduced again from photolithographic process. There was certainly none of the usual telltale branding used by engravers of the period. In the late 1890s, he created a few covers for the children's magazine La Jeunesse Amusante, and was also working for another aimed at school children, Le Petit Français Illustré. In anticipation of Paris's Exposition Universelle, scheduled to open in 1900, Robida was commissioned at the time to design a life-size reconstruction of a large section of medieval Paris as a place for visitors to tour and presumably find quaintly charming, in clear contradiction of Haussmann's geometrically laid out and imposing modernisation. And in addition to the design and supervision of this immense undertaking, there was all manner of other peripheral imagery connected to the event illustrated by Robida. There were 25 chromolithographically printed postcards of medieval characters, which were used to promote the Bon Marché department store. And more significantly, he wrote and illustrated La Nef de Lutèce, a tale about Paris in the days when it was still called Lutèce from the Roman Lutetia. The book was styled as a plausible medieval illuminated manuscript, which was let down somewhat by two-colour printing. And in 1900, Robida embarked on another major undertaking to illustrate the tales of Honoré de Balzac, which, although written in the early 19th century, were all set in a joyously ribald evocation of the Middle Ages. The work was another which was published serially between 1900 and 1905, and contained many wildly imaginative farcical images. The story of Captain Belormeau was a particularly absorbing tale of swashbuckling musketeers, and Robida's line and wash illustrations more than rose to the challenge of evoking the period and manners of the time. The properties of this work in particular caused me to speculate about the research he would have needed to conduct in order to produce such images. I found no record that he used life models, but it's hard to imagine that he didn't, if only to create initial sketches and posing of his characters. And similarly, he must have relied on solid observation of one sort or another in the depiction of credible props, architecture and landscape. It was also in 1900 that he published a loose visualization of the ancient Greek stories of the philosopher and writer Musaeus of Athens. Robida's version was set in a medievally themed fantasy world, and in this instance they were drawn with pen and ink and an additional half-tone wash overlay. In 1902, the humour magazine L'Assiette au Beurre devoted a whole issue to Robida's work and commissioned him to create satirical illustrations of the French enjoying themselves at the seaside. This was a highly amusing collection of cartoons and caricatures of his fellow citizens, with some good-natured but nevertheless pointed observations about human nature. It was 1904 when he returned with the visualization of Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. This, like so many of the other already written works he had chosen to illustrate, was a perfect fit for his talents. The period was, of course, immaculately evoked, and the fantasy narrative of Swift's satires of the folly of humans was brought to life with a collection of pen and colour wash vignetted images. and the same year saw the publication of Robida's children's story, The Castle of the Flew. But it wasn't illustrated by him. That task he generously gave to his daughter Emily, who was herself working as an illustrator with a stylistic approach uncannily similar to that of her father's. And 1905 saw the publication of another successful collaboration between the two with the fantasy tale of King Beta. In 1906, Robida's The Besieged of Compiègne was a written and illustrated account of the 1430 siege of his hometown by the forces of Philip III of Burgundy, and the downfall and death of Joan of Arc. The line and wash illustrations he produced successfully evoked the historical period with his expected credibility and attention to detail, and it was appropriately tackled as a faithful historical account of the event and those involved. This sober, more seriously minded work was followed in 1908 by similarly medievally themed and agreeably sketchy colour images, but this time with considerably more humour and fantasy, for a collection titled Fables and Tales of the Middle Ages. And just for good measure, yet another book, this time of the old towns of Flanders, was also published in that year. If that wasn't more than enough for any mortal, it was also in 1908 that the first instalment of La Guerre Infernale, a futuristic weekly serial for children written by Pierre Giffard, was published. And in addition to the full-colour lithographically printed covers for every episode, Robida also created in excess of 500 pen and ink illustrations which were dotted throughout the written narratives. And although speculative, there were once more some uncanny predictions regarding an attack on London by Germany and a conflict between Japan and the United States. In 1909 there were several more books published. The first was a serious-minded historical account of the French king Francois I, with text by Georges Gustave Toulouse. Predictably, it was another work of considerable authority, along similar lines both stylistically and in terms of its serious tone to the previous Siege of Compiègne. 1909 also saw the publication of Robida's visualizations of stories from the 1001 Nights, including colour and monochrome work for Aladdin, Sinbad the Sailor, and Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. All the images he created in support of these Middle Eastern and Oriental fantasies were suitably exotic and frequently visually dramatic, but unfortunately the colour was somewhat erratically applied and the printing was not of the best quality. The Phantom Balloon, written by Jacques de Gachon, was also published in that year. This adventure book featured tonal wash images painted by Robida, but they were only printed in monochrome grayscale and failed to have the same engagement as his full-colour work. In 1910 he created line illustrations for Cyrano de Bergerac's 17th century humorist novel The Other World, which is considered by many to be one of the earliest examples of science fiction. And although Robida's illustrations were quite casually, if energetically, drawn in pen and ink and printed very small on the pages, they nevertheless illuminated this humorous fantasy with some success. 1910 was also the year in which Robida's illustrated edition of Three Women for One Husband, a Burmese tale by Lois Voisin, was published. I'm fairly certain that those I'm showing have been taken from his originals rather than from printed sources, and as such they positively glow with the saturated bright washes he used in their making. In 1911, Le Tour du Monde, written by Léon Berthaud, was a story which owed a considerable debt to the work of Jules Verne, and for its publication Robida created fascinating futuristic adventure images which were unfortunately only printed as monochrome grayscale. The Island of Centaurs was published in 1912, and this was another of Robida's own fantasy tales, which bore a certain resemblance to Swift's Gulliver, but nevertheless it was an engaging speculation on the stranger in a strange land device frequently used by satirists to make their point about contemporary issues in the real world. Various alarmingly disparate years are given for the publication of Robida's edition of The Adventures of Baron Munchausen, but 1914 seems to be the best of the contenders. but whatever the year it was first published, it was another inspired pairing of author and illustrator. Munchausen's fantastical accounts of his outlandish accomplishments were visualised in Robida's illustrations with obvious relish, and in addition to smaller spot monochromes, there was another collection of full pages with what looks like a return to his mechanically overprinted work of decades before. Having said that, it could well be that the book was in fact published much earlier and nobody got the year right. When Robida's early prediction of future war became sickening reality in 1914, what work he did produce was almost exclusively a reflection on the conflict. His gloomy illustrations were published in both Le Rire Rouge and La Bayonette, and as reports of the wholesale slaughter taking place, aided by the very mechanisation his earlier work had predicted. The terrible irony couldn't have been wasted on him. And other than this humorous Don Quixote-themed press ad from 1916, the war was his only topic, whether in magazines or as lithographs and watercolour paintings. In 1918 the war ended, and in that year Robida turned 70. But he carried on working, and in that year he published Good King Dragobert, an ancient French song turned into a prose story by Georges Tremisseau, with a collection of comedic, medievally themed line illustrations from Robida. A year later, his own more serious novel, The Engineer von Satanas, was published, also featuring sketchy pen and ink line drawings. There were other projects over the next few years, but I came up with nothing of good enough quality to show until 1925, when Robida published his last novel, Chalet in the Sky, another work of futuristic fantasy, which, although monochrome only, was still possessed of the same energy, wit and imagination that had fueled his 6-decade-long career. And he died in 1926 at the age of 78 in Neuilly-sur-Seine, just outside Paris. Despite the fact that this tribute has been significantly longer than any other I've made, there was still a fair amount of work I couldn't show in the form of other books and magazine illustrations, simply because I couldn't track down any usable images of them. Nevertheless, I like to think that this is at least a moderately exhaustive look at the accumulated output of a man who produced what I can only describe as a superhuman volume of creative writing and illustration in his lifetime.